It's my honor to introduce our speaker today, Steve Papalas. Howard Papalas.
Thank you. I was practicing this the wrong way around.
Yeah, that's good.
Wrote it down upside down.
Yeah, I've taught with Steve at Kent State for about, I think I've been there 18 years, and he's been there, well, let me just mention. Steve was a history teacher for 33 years in Dallas City Schools. He's been a professor of history at Kent State for 28 years. He's been there longer than me. He graduated from YSU with his bachelor's and master's in history. He was an ROTC graduate and served 12 years in Army Reserve. For 38 years, Steve served on Dallas City Council, where rumor has it he never once lost an election. Currently, along with teaching at Kent State, he is working as administrative assistant at Trumbull County Engineer's Office, works for Randy Smith. In 2016, Steve and a group visited Europe on the Band of Brothers tour. If you've ever watched the Band of Brothers, he got to see several sites that Easy Company got to witness during World War II. By the way, if you've never seen Band of Brothers, it's on the History Channel Thursday, all day. Worth watching. Maybe the best thing you've ever seen. I've had the opportunity to see Steve's presentation, sneak peek of it, and it's very insightful, and I hope you get the enjoyment out of it that I do. So, without further ado, Steve Papalas.
Thank you, everybody. I was told by Dick here that if I go too long, the signal's going to be when he stands up. So, remember that. Remember when we didn't need these? I want to start with the end of my presentation. And that's the fact that I respect all veterans, whether they served in a war or peacetime. I respect them all. I think we all feel the same way, because without you, we and our families would not have been able to sleep so securely at night as we have. And without you, our children and grandchildren wouldn't look forward to the future that we hope they have. Thank you. The guns of World War I finally fell silent at 11 a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. By that time, the European countries had realized that they had lost nearly a generation of young men since that war had begun in 1914. For our country, 225,000 American boys were wounded in the 19 months of that war. Additionally to that, another 116,516 lost their lives either in battlefield action or to diseases such as pneumonia or influenza. In March of 1919, our government sent ballots to the next of kin of fallen Americans. 61% chose to bring their loved ones home for permanent burial. And so 8 cemeteries were thus dedicated as the final resting place for the remaining 29,265 American men and women. That map there that I'm showing you now designates the World War I cemeteries in blue. And the brown, the light brown, those are the cemeteries of the Second World War. In 1926, a congressional resolution gave Armistice Day its official recognition. 12 years later, Congress declared Armistice Day a national holiday. I have not yet visited a World War I national cemetery in Europe, but I have, however, visited for long hours 3 World War II American cemeteries, and I'll speak about that in just a couple of minutes. But as I wandered among the graves of the many thousands of young men and women who did not come home as a result of that war, I thought of many things. Mostly, I wondered how many of these boys, and some women, there are a few nurses in these cemeteries, would have contributed to society had they been able to grow old with families of their own. I want to give you an example of some Americans who came home and contributed great things to society and to humanity in many different ways. There was, for example, Captain Harry S. Truman, Battery D, the 129th Regiment of the 35th Infantry. He saw heavy action in St. Mihiel and in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. And after the war ended and he came home, he was so proud of his military service that he spent the rest of his life as a member of the VFW. And as we all know in this room, Harry Truman went on to become a president of the United States. Another person who came home was Lieutenant Christopher Mathewson, who had served as an Army Chemical Warfare serviceman. He went on, after the war, to become the greatest pitcher of his day. And I'm sure we all remember this fellow, Walter Brennan. During the war, he was a private at Sea Battery, the 101st Field Artillery, 26th Infantry Regiment. Walter Brennan was gassed so many times in battle that he lost most of his teeth. He survived the battles of Aisne-Marne, St. Mihiel, and the Meuse-Argonne offensive. He came home and involved himself in an illustrious acting career, ending it with the Real McCoys, in which he was grandpa, as you may recall. There's also Edwin Hubble, who was a major in the 2nd Battalion of the 86th Regiment. After the war, he went on to become the greatest astronomer of his day, the 20th century. You've all heard of the Hubble telescope. It's named after him. How about Ernest Hemingway? He was a Red Cross second lieutenant, serving as an ambulance driver in Italy. As a matter of fact, he's one of the first Americans to be wounded in Italy, having been shot by a machine gunner while carrying a wounded Italian soldier to safety. After he recovered from that wound, he was caught in an artillery barrage, receiving 200 shrapnel wounds to his legs. He survived the war. He came home and became a writer. Many books, one of them, most popular perhaps, is A Farewell to Arms, which was based on his World War I experiences. And in that book, one of his passages that he wrote states, "I was always embarrassed by the words sacred, glorious, and sacrifice. I'd seen nothing sacred, and the things that were glorious had no glory. And the sacrifices were like the stockyards at Chicago, if nothing was done with the meat except to bury it." Hemingway, like many other young writers of his day who had gone to the war and come home, was very disillusioned by everything around him. He saw no solution. There was no accomplishment as a result of the war in his eyes. And so he and other writers came to be known as the Lost Generation. On December 7th, 1941, the United States was involved in an even greater war than the Great War, as World War I had once been known. As a matter of fact, 16 million Americans served their country in this conflict, which finally ended in 1945. The first Veterans Day celebration was organized in Alabama by a veteran of the Second World War, Raymond Weeks. He called it National Veterans Day, and it was celebrated on Armistice Day, and it became so popular that in 1954, Congress passed a bill which President Eisenhower, who by the way was a veteran of both World Wars, signed, proclaiming Veterans Day, a national holiday to be observed on November 11th every year. It was only fitting the Congress and the President brought that bill forth and passed it. Only fitting because we had so many veterans who had served in the 20th century in World War I and World War II alone. Don't forget this. In World War II, 670,000 Americans were wounded. Another 291,000 lost their lives. I visited 3 of those American cemeteries dedicated to our World War II dead. Actually, there are a total of 25 cemeteries and monuments dedicated to America's war dead in Europe. I don't know if any of you have ever had the opportunity to walk through those cemeteries, but I want to impress upon you that it leaves a person with a very somber and humbling feeling. It left us with this feeling of tremendous loss. You wonder when you walk among those graves, who among them would have become our president? Who would have been a great professor? Who would have been a doctor? How would somebody have discovered a cure to cancer or a cure to Alzheimer's? Would there have been a statesman there? Had there not been a war, or had they survived? We'll never know. That's the loss. But I do want to remind you of some people who did come home and went on to achieve great things, whether it was in politics or in science or otherwise. Among them, John F. Kennedy in his PT 109. We all know he went on to become a president of the United States. How about this fellow? Yogi Berra, who served as second-class seaman gunner's mate on the attack transport USS Bayfield. During the Normandy invasion on June 6, 1944, Berra was part of a 6-man crew on a small Navy rocket boat that plied along the coast of Omaha Beach, firing their machine guns and rockets at German defenses high above. For his efforts that day, Berra received a Purple Heart for a bullet wound fired from one of those German gunners. Lieutenant Richard Nixon served in the United States Navy in the Pacific War. He went on, as you know, to become President of the United States. Anyone remember the name Tom Landry? I'm sure you do. He joined the Army Air Corps after his brother Robert was killed when his B-17 crashed into the North Sea. Landry went on to fly 30 combat missions over Europe in his own B-17, surviving one crash landing when his bomber ran out of fuel. He survived the war and went on to become a great professional football coach. Private First Class Kurt Vonnegut of the 106th Infantry Division was captured in the Battle of the Bulge. His captors eventually sent him to Dresden as part of a 150-man labor detachment where he worked virtually as a slave in a malt syrup factory. They housed Vonnegut and his colleagues in a nearby slaughterhouse where they stayed underground in meat lockers. Vonnegut's address at that time was Schlachthol 5, which translates into Slaughterhouse 5. On the night of February 14th, 1945, the Allies began a 24-hour bombing mission against the city of Dresden. We'll never know how many people perished in that conflagration because there were so many refugees moving in and out of that city every day. Vonnegut, however, survived the attack with many of his colleagues because they hid in that underground meat locker throughout that 24-hour period of time. Afterward, for the next 2 months, Vonnegut spent his days pulling corpses from the ruins of Dresden and throwing them on pyres. After the war, Vonnegut went on to write many other works, including 14 novels. One of the most famous of which came out in 1969. Slaughterhouse 5. There are others. There's Clark Gable, who was a B-17 waist gunner over Europe. Private First Class Lee Marvin in the United States Marine Corps, fought in the Pacific, severely wounded in the battle for Saipan. You know Jimmy Stewart. During the war, he was a colonel in the 445th Bombardment Group. He led B-24 raids deep into Germany, insisting on personally piloting the lead aircraft of every one of those missions. After the war ended, he stayed in the service and served in the Air Force Reserves, being promoted eventually in 1959 to Brigadier General. By that time, he was a pilot on B-52 bombers in the Strategic Air Command. By that time, he was also one of the most popular movie stars of his day. There's another one who was rather popular, Paul Newman, who served as a staff sergeant and turret gunner on an Avenger aircraft. He wanted to be a fighter pilot, but he was washed out of flight school because he was colorblind. And so, as a turret gunner, he was assigned to the USS Bunker Hill, an aircraft carrier preparing for the coming campaign in Okinawa. He and the rest of his squadron were replacements for other units that had been lost in combat. The day they were supposed to fly out to the aircraft carrier, however, Newman's pilot developed a severe earache, and so they were grounded that day. The rest of the squadron flew out to the aircraft carrier and into history. The carrier Bunker Hill was involved indeed in the Battle of Okinawa, and unfortunately and tragically, during that battle, a kamikaze pilot flew into the aircraft carrier, killing most of Newman's squadron. Private Rod Sterling. Did you ever watch The Twilight Zone? Well, he served in the 511th Regiment of the 11th Airborne Division in the Pacific Theater. He also took part in the invasion of the Philippines and was involved in door-to-door fighting in the city of Manila in an attempt to liberate that city from the Japanese. By the time it was over, Sterling's regiment suffered 50% casualties. He went home after the war and suffered from nightmares and night sweats for the rest of his life. We know him because he created and narrated The Twilight Zone, in which he personally wrote or produced 92 of the 156 episodes. Most of the episodes he produced were based on his nightmares or his experiences in combat. And then there's Second Lieutenant Bob Dole, the 10th Mountain Division, severely wounded by Nazi machine gun fire in the hills of Italy. He permanently loses the use of one arm. He'll survive the war, however, and go on to become a great U.S. Senator. Lieutenant Commander Gerald Ford, on the right, was on board the light aircraft carrier Monterey, serving in the Pacific Theater during the Second World War, and he also took part in the Okinawa campaign. And he also came home and eventually became a president of the United States. I don't know if you ever heard of Jack Loomis, but his actions say something about what this man was made of. He was a famous, well-known end on the New York Giants football team. And a couple days after Pearl Harbor, Loomis took a leave of absence from the Giants to join the U.S. Marine Corps, where eventually he finds himself in the Battle of Iwo Jima, where he won the Medal of Honor for many acts of heroism. Tragically, he was mortally wounded, and as he bled to death there on that island, he said to his field doctor, "Well, Doc, the New York Giants lost a mighty good end today." Lieutenant George Bush, the Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers. He was shot down over open water. And in that same mission, 8 other pilots were also shot down, captured by the Japanese and executed. Bush spent some time on a raft in the open sea before the submarine USS Finback rescued him. Bush went on to fly 58 missions against the Japanese in the Pacific Theater. And he also went on, as you know, to become a president of the United States. There are many, many more people like this. There are millions of others who survived the war. There are millions of others who served in other periods of time afterwards, who came home, and they did their part as well for society. They had families, they were responsible, they went to work, and many of them spent every day of their lives trying to improve humanity, or trying to improve their communities. One of them, especially, is in this room today. And that would be Dr. Fred Solar. Dr. Solar, every time I give a presentation, I try to dedicate it to someone or some group of people. And so I just want you to know that I dedicated this presentation today to you.
Thank you.
But I also want to salute, as I said before I started this, every veteran in this room, no matter where you served or when you served or whatever capacity, because that's why we're as secure as we are. That's why we're the country we are. So I thank you, men and women.